so that we can upload this and post it later. Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome back to our organic no-till series. My name's Johanna Murray. Most of you probably logged in before, so you know that I'm the extension coordinator here at PCBFA. We're an applied research association based out of Fairview, Alberta. So we do forage crop research and on-farm trials, and we do that across the piece. So if you're interested in any of our research on cocktails, or we've done some testing with different kinds of non-typical fertilizers and use of manure on crops and that sort of stuff, you can find it under the Applied Research tab on our website, peacecountrybeef.ca, or you can contact us on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and we can get you hooked up with some of our reports. For any of you who are joining us for the first time, I think we will do questions throughout the presentation. Ward, if you just want to pause every so often, we can answer questions. There's a Q&A box down at the bottom, either the bottom or the top of your screen, where you can type in your questions, or there's a raise hand button that you can use. And if I see that you've raised your hand while we're looking for questions, I can unmute you and you can ask your question over your mic. And if audio is giving you trouble, you can phone in. There's an option to call in for audio, or if you're having lots of technical difficulties, we will be uploading this recording here next week and sending out the recording to everybody who's registered before we make it available to the public at large. Is there anything I'm missing, Marianne?
No, that's perfect.
All right. So that will be my spiel for today. And without further ado, we'll let Ward take it away and talk about some crop livestock integration.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Marianne. So my name's Ward Middleton. I'm a little bit of a Luddite in my technology, so I don't have a computer that has a camera, and which is good because, as you can see from the picture that I posted, and for clarity, I'm the bald one in this picture. The small one is my boss, and she's not here right now, but because this is gonna be recorded, I will endeavor to be on my best behavior. So today I'm just invited to talk in this series where about our journey integrating livestock onto our small market organic grain farm. And through the course of this next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a brief description of our farm, talk about what inspired us to integrate livestock onto our grain farm, and some of the challenges we grappled with about how to include livestock without ownership. You will get the sense as I talk over this that I recognize fully that I am not predisposed to be a person who has good animal husbandry skills. My wife chastises me for being a little bit quick-tempered with livestock. Impatient might be a better term, and also they keep me awake at night. The stress of animal welfare sometimes I would find a burden. And then at the end of it, I'm going to summarize this by going through what we have identified as a number of the benefits and challenges of a grain farm partnering with a livestock operation. So to start with, the location of our farm, right in north central Alberta, halfway between Edmonton and Westlock, right alongside Highway 2, that is the main north-south corridor. If any of you ever travel this route and you're coming in on Highway 2 towards Edmonton and you see a baby blue colored sign along the side of the road that says pork freezer packs or pork and beef for sale, that is the testament to me losing the battle with my wife and my children, and that accursed 4-H club that I've been quoted as saying is the gateway drug to farming with livestock. Even though they all cause me stress, every person in my life wants to drag home animals to our farm. So that was the natural progression. This is a Google Earth aerial shot of the section of land that is our primary farm. We do farm another 200 acres or manage another 200 acres on top of this, but those fields are further away. And this, for the purpose of this discussion, all of the livestock integration thus far has only taken place on this section of land. The reason that those 3 quarters are highlighted differently, 3 of them are cultivated or arable land for grain production, and the other quarter that's outlined in red is a custom grazing silvopasture. And just for your bearings, if you can see my cursor, Joanne, can you nod? You do see my cursor, right? On the east side of this section of land is where Highway 2 comes up alongside. Joanna, I just show that my presentation has disconnected and it looks like it's trying to reconnect.
Yeah, I see that. You should be able to.
Oh, it's come back. I can just reshare my screen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sorry, everybody. I had expressed some concerns before, and Joanna patiently sat with me to. We did a test. Sometimes our wireless ExploreNet internet service provider provides us with a little bit of sketchy connection. So just bear with me and I'll restart that slideshow. Hopefully we don't have that too many times.
There we go.
All right, we're good again. Sorry about that, everyone.
Looks good.
All right, so carrying on with the description of our farm, we have, of those 3 quarters that you saw on the previous slide, 1/3 of that land base, one of those 3 quarters roughly every year would be in a green manure crop where we're growing something to hopefully fix nitrogen. It also works as our weed suppression year where we're hopefully diminishing some of the population in the seed bank, weed seed bank. And originally we had always reincorporated by tillage, but then in this last 7 or 8 years, we got ourselves a 20-foot wide 3-point hitch crop shredder, stalk shredder, like a corn stalk shredder that they would use in the United States for terminating green manure, just in the interest of trying to find ways to till less. And more recently, because of the integration of livestock, we terminate green manure crops also now by grazing. The rotation of that grain land in any of the other years would include selections from annual cereals, winter cereals, legumes, oil seeds. We've, every few years, just for the notoriety, my wife accuses me of growing some more obscure herbal and nutraceutical crops. And in all fairness, those were the crops that enticed us originally back in 1998 to certify our farm, as we were searching for ways to make a relatively small land base economically self-sufficient as a business entity. So we also intersperse forages on that cultivated land. Now, typically those had been legumes for plow down that were annual or biennial. Sweet clover tended to be our preferred nitrogen fixing crop. But now, for the first time in 20 years, now that we've integrated livestock, we do see the economic sense of putting land back into alfalfa. We had always shied away from alfalfa because we would have been, if we were selling that hay off our land, it would have exported so much nutrient. And so it's nice to have that reintroduced. In our cropping, we already had been doing a fair amount of intercropping practice. I'd love to tell you that it was solely because long ago I had embraced the principles of regenerative agriculture, but truly I'm only just this past 4 years been learning about regenerative principles. And this became a good example of something that we chose to do for what turned out to only be a few of the right reasons, and it turned out there were lots of other reasons for it. So we've done intercrop combinations, listed over the years down the side here, including at any time we're growing a cereal. If we don't have something intercropped with it, we will always go put sweet clover with it in a post-emergent harrowing pass that is as close as we can get to like a post-emergent herbicide. It's just we're just putting on a ferrous activation instead of a chemical activation. It's just we're using iron. So we incorporate the sweet clover seed while we're harrowing the wheat when it's about the 3-leaf stage, and we try to target doing that when the annual weeds are about the size of a dime, and we'll get it. Typically, I would estimate 75 to 90% control of those annual weeds that are up in that pass, as long as they're smaller than the end of your finger. But I posted this picture because we'll be talking about this crop and some of the other nutrient considerations further on. So it's Staedtler wheat with Golden Flax Understood underneath it. And down below, right where my cursor is looking, you can see that there's some sweet clover down there as well. Now, in all honesty, that sweet clover was a volunteer crop because we had harvested sweet clover forage seed off the year before. And by the end of it, we decided to let the volunteer biennial crop stay the next year, which saved us one more tillage pass, and it became our green manure crop the next year. So I just want to touch on the same aerial view of our farm for some watershed considerations. This left to right, coming diagonally across our farm, is a drainage canal that was dug to stop some upstream flooding in Egg Lake or Manawan Lake. Egg Lake is the slang term for it. It's a small, shallow lake upstream from us, and it's really just a glorified slough. I don't think it ever gets more than about 3 feet deep. But because it's so shallow, heavy rain events will make severe flooding. So just after World War II, they draglined this canal. It came through our farm, and at that time, it drained this seasonal lake bed that was nicknamed Little Egg Lake. That's kind of outlined by this oven mitt. And just to talk about the topography, this drainage canal in this quarter section has an elevation drop of a foot every half mile. So we're as flat here as they would be in the Red River Valley. And this outline is the beach land, so people will laugh at me when I'll say, oh, well, we'll just walk up the hill in this field, and I know where the beach land is, but it really takes a discerning eye to see the elevation change. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you some of the problems and challenges of this quarter as though you were standing at this crossroad on the county roads. So in 2001, as we were transitioning to organic, we took and cultivated this soil. My father had always kept it in pasture just because it produced hay very well, and it presented a lot of challenges. Quackgrass wants to grow in that soil. It's soft, fluffy soil that's 25% organic matter, and when they draglined that drainage canal through it, they never actually touched clay through the entire lake bed. It's 25% organic matter and at least 10 feet of topsoil there. And so it sounds wonderful, but this is one of the challenges. If you till it, the soil structure is friable and it breaks down into just fibrous silt, and it will blow like crazy. Now, 2 years later in the spring, or a year and a half later from when I took that picture, this is an example of any time we have either a fast snowmelt and that drainage canal will overflow or run at capacity and the surrounding water floods, and we can see the old lake bed again. So it does present some challenges, and we decided that to farm organically without, burn off herbicide, that was definitely going to be a challenge. And we then decided that we were going to take that quarter section and turn it into a custom grazing pasture. So these rows represent boundary lines inside the quarter section perimeter fence. And the yellow lines are just a fence, and the green lines are a fence, but also a row of sea buckthorn berry trees that were a little bit of an experimentation. So that's why I refer to it as a silvopasture, because we're also producing fruit-bearing shrubs on this land. So we also put in a pasture pipeline, buried pasture pipeline, from a dugout that was on the adjacent quarter, as well as to a dugout that was on this quarter. The green dots are water troughs that would provide water to either of 2 paddocks, each of those paddocks being 20 acres. And if we have a dry year and one dugout goes dry, we can just pick up and move our solar panel and pump and head tank and move it over to the other dugout so we can feed from it. So it works out well, and we've been grazing, 100 cow-calf pairs on that through the summer. It's very productive soil, and yeah, I guess I'll just go to the next slide and we can see that although we have cattle on this land, at this point, back, from 2004 to 2014, we had cattle on our land, on our farm, but they ran solely as a separate business unit. And even though we had grain production on each of these other quarters, and you can see I've got a legume here to represent, that would be my nitrogen fixing green manure crop. We essentially say, well, 1/3 of that land base is going to be in a green manure crop, and it's only going to cost us money that year. And so, of course, here we had this enterprise of happy cows that were making us money, but essentially that money, in my mind, very nicely seemed to cover the cost of establishing and terminating, tilling in a green manure crop for nitrogen gain. And so essentially those two were awash economically. And so our primary business unit, other than a little bit of extra land, was 300 to 400 acres of organic grains or organic annual crops. And now this is just a shot of the boss. She's harvesting some sea buckthorn, and it provided some extra potential for income, but the reality is it's lots of work. The berries don't come off the branches. They rupture when you try to pull them off. So you prune the branches, you freeze the berries, and they shatter off like in the Skittles commercial, and they'll sell anywhere between $3.50 to $5 a pound. But for the last 3 years, grain harvest has been so late and so tumultuous that we just haven't even bothered getting the opportunity. By the time we finish harvest, it's already snowed 3 times. So it's an opportunity revenue that can be there, but it's not always a guaranteed thing. So I want to move on now and identify that it was soil nutrient concerns that made us consider using cattle on the surrounding grain land. In 2015, 2016, we were motivated to consider our whole farm nutrient budget by 2 of the following programs that were run by the Prairie Organic Grain Initiative. And POGI was the unfortunate nickname for this initiative that was run by the organic associations of all of the Western provinces together. It was funded by the organic grain industry. Like, grain buyers came to the associations and said, we need more product to develop more of our downstream products. More of our customers want this, but there's not enough supply of organic grain, and so they gave money to support it. It was to support this initiative, and it was matched by Western diversification. And these 2 of these programs that came out of that, the Farm Nutrient Management Program and Organic Agronomy Training, really compelled us on this path to integrate cattle. And the Farm Nutrient Program, we're going to see some of the pictures from both of these programs, but the real eye-opener for me in that was that they kind of used the farm nutrient program as a means of training the organic agronomy students, in the sense that to have an agronomist understand the difference between a fairly biodynamic system, a biological or natural system, compared to a traditional system. They would come out and sample in our green manure crop in various places in the field. They'd soil sample, but they would also take a tissue sample off the surface on 1 square meter and separate that and dry it down and essentially do a nutrient analysis of that, like a feed analysis. And the University of Manitoba had provided benchmarks that would say, if this type of plant is healthy, this is the nutrient that would be in it. If it's getting everything that it needs nutrient-wise, these would be the benchmarks. And then you would compare those results to the soil sample, and it was a real eye-opener for me as well as for the agronomy training students, that the soil sample would often say that it was deficient, and yet the plant was healthy. And so it became a means of recognizing how the biological system, the microbes, and that entire soil health was feeding the plant what it needed in forms that the soil test couldn't otherwise see. So don't be intimidated by this slide. This is just a rotational nutrient budget, but I want to point out that this 2015 crop of wheat and flax was the one that you saw in the picture. And in that year, per acre, that crop of wheat and flax took off a net nutrient that's shown right there by that arrow. And that'll become interesting later, and we'll circle back to this slide again. What surprised me was that volunteer crop of sweet clover that I thought, oh, that's perfect. I don't have to seed that. It came natural. In hindsight, I really should have gone in a cover cropping practice. I should have seeded more into it, because it didn't really get the nitrogen fixation that I was expecting. I always intend that I should be, in my green manure year, putting 2 years worth of nutrient into the soil of nitrogen, and that was not the case. The other thing is, anytime there's a green manure, it's not necessarily adding anything to the soil that wasn't there as far as the other macronutrients. It might just make it more available, but it's not adding it like it is with nitrogen. So here's a slide I shamelessly stole from the Prairie Organic Agronomy Training Program that shows the uptake of nutrient removal of various crops. And this sort of thing is available. It's ubiquitous on the internet. This was just an easy slide for me to take. But here's an example of why we weren't exporting alfalfa. Is that, 2.5 tons to the acre, which is bang on the average for our area without, we're not in an irrigation area. So this is the sort of nutrient removal that we would be doing if we were exporting that from our farm. And that's why we had stayed away from alfalfa for a long time until we integrated livestock. And Wally Ham, who was the founder of ProCert certification for organic certification, I sat in on his soil agronomy 101, soil nutrition 101 lecture a couple of times, and this was back in 2012, and he was saying at those prices, fertilizer prices then, that 1 round bale of alfalfa was removing a net dollar equivalent at fertilizer prices of $70 per round bale. And so that was the first time I started to think of organic nutrient management in terms of direct dollars spent and removed. And I'm not sure if Martin Entz is on the call, but he's responsible for a lot of this, I believe. So thanks, Martin, if you're listening. And this is a typical organic rotation where they do green manure, then a wheat, then a pulse, then an oat. It's a bit more ambitious than what we're doing. Just because of weed pressure, we do a green manure once every 2 years. Here they were doing it, or we do a green manure once every 3 years. Here they're doing it once every 4. And you can see that with cautious management, they could calculate that nitrogen wasn't necessarily a concern, that there could be enough balance over the course of that rotation. However, what do you do with this if we're constantly mining that out of our soil and chipping it away? Now, I have heard Gabe Brown on some of his podcasts talk and say, well, there's a mineral bed that he can mine that soil all the way to China as long as he can get a root down there. But that to me is a bold statement, because I've already proven that my crops aren't necessarily doing exactly what I thought in my green manure year. And so this also gives me pause. So as an organic farm, how can we replace those nutrients? And of course, within the organic regime and the Canadian organic standards, we are allowed to put organic compliant fertilizers in the form of rock phosphate. Langbonite is a mineral that's potassium magnesium sulfate. We're also allowed to put elemental sulfur, but sourcing them, transporting them, didn't appeal to us because, you know, like they're costly to get. They're not necessarily immediately available. I'm not right beside a langbonite mine in Saskatchewan. And it also doesn't add any biological benefit that by this time in this consideration, we're starting to think about more than just the nutrient. So we did look at import of compostable material for spreading, and it became this comparison to, well, obviously if we import feed for cows and convert it into soil nutrient, that would be easy enough to do. But which one would be better? We were a little bit intimidated about bringing cows onto our land because it seemed far more complex than just getting compost material, composting it, and spreading it. That was just machinery operation that we understood. And if you saw my pristine air seeder, circa 1986 on the first slide, you know I'm also good at fixing equipment. So, you know, that worked for us. But the cows were intimidating, but we still recognized it as a good potential means of importing soil nutrient. So we decided that on the left-hand side of that white line, that is a railway track that also comes across our farm, we would do composting project in our main yard, right? That's where our home place is right there. And in that land between that little snail-shaped dugout and the railway tracks, we would set up a composting yard there, and we would source whatever feedstocks we could and make compost and spread it on all those little fields between the railway tracks and the highway that would have been problematic to fence. You can see this field here would be a bit of a challenge. It's 15 acres and it's shaped like a backwards question mark. So on the other side of the railway tracks, we already had a custom grazing pasture through the summer of happy cows here. So we would just start to utilize those cows by bringing them out during the summertime to graze off any green manure crop that we had growing, to extend the grazing season in the pasture as well, giving us a bit wider grazing revenue. Plus we would also in the winter then move those cows out onto that cultivated stubble land and do winter feeding. So stepping back briefly to the compost feedstocks, we looked at, you know, options of waste or spoiled grains from the local seed cleaning plants or grain elevators. If there was any spillage that could get cleaned up and composted, screenings and weed seeds or grain that had been cleaned because it was ergot contaminated. Those things, some people were a little bit incredulous that we would take weed seeds, but if we compost them effectively, I'm not concerned about that. In fact, everything that comes on in this fashion, even if it does wind up being animal manure like down at the bottom, we're reluctant to just spread raw animal manure because those people who can use herbicide to control scentless chamomile don't seem to be as concerned about it in their manure pile or in their barnyard or whatever, but I don't have that option, so I was going to compost everything. And that I just wanted to put there because I figured Cody might be on, and I want to show that if you're organic, all of this stuff, you gotta dot your I's, cross your T's, click your heels, march in line. Oh, I know, Cody's raising his eyebrows right now. So my son, as I said, has this pasture-fed pork business. It's not huge. He's got like 5 or 6 sows usually, 2 litters a year. And he's 24 now, and he's moved away. I don't know how it works that the pigs are still on our land, but he shows up twice a day to feed his pigs. But anytime we can get our hands on stuff that has feed value, instead of just putting it directly into our compost pile, we've learned that we're having difficulty getting what I'd consider hot compost feedstock. And so the pigs can convert this dry matter, spoiled grain or waste grain or grain dust. We'll just dump it in there and leave them with it for the season. And then when we gather it up and add it to our compost, it acts like a compost accelerant. And we source manure from neighbors, but it all comes at a cost. Depends how far it has to be hauled. And, we had considered spreading it directly, but as I said, there's a risk of introducing weed seeds. And, God knows we already have a lovely, healthy array of organic weed seeds. I don't want to add any new ones to that population if I can avoid it. And then don't be intimidated by this. I just threw that up there thinking that was a good idea, but it's just, I believe, might have been the Alberta Agriculture website, but it's just looking at the nutrient content. So can I afford to pay for manure to haul it here? If I do, I have to consider what my costs are to haul it. And even if there are benchmark standards for different nutrients, really manure is a hassle. All of that presents challenges, and the reality is that we haven't even finished those costs yet. We hire a commercial compost spreader to come in. It sounds expensive. He runs for, I think, $550 an hour while he's running that, but he'll come in and turn 4 rows that are 80 to 100 meters long in an hour. And if I were trying to do that with my front end loader on my tractor, it would take me a lot longer. But the reality is there's more costs for the compost. And even when we get the compost finished, there's the cost of spreading it. And this is just a snapshot of the custom rates guide from Alberta Agriculture, which we use a lot in this whole consideration. And without dwelling on any of it, there's not really any small numbers here for the cost of spreading manure. So just like buying fertilizer, the cost for the compost will be significant, but the underlying benefit is that if we do it right, we do definitely get a microbial benefit, a soil health benefit from the compost that we wouldn't get from just mineral fertilizer. So now, sorry, that took me a little while to get on to the custom feeding of cows. But we're looking at it solely at the start as a nutrient import. And the things to consider were thoroughly intimidating for me, but to all of you livestock people, run a hay buster. What if we were going to do silage? You'll see a little later on, we got a picture. We decided to get some hay stackers and do hay stacks. And we also, if we are going to feed, it presents the opportunity to do chaff collection from the grain harvest. But I don't know anything about cattle, so this intimidates me. How do I know that they're getting fed appropriately? So even if I could go out and buy cows, I know nothing about this. And other than the opinion of my mother-in-law, it's not that I'm a stupid person, but I could figure it out. But the reality was, it intimidated me. And Mom, if you're listening, I was just teasing. So at the end of it, who does the feeding? What is the value of this labor? And like I was talking before about the nutrition, what about the overall health of the animal, monitoring their condition? What if one gets pink eye? What if one gets foot rot? Again, these are the things that keep me awake at night. Lots of unknowns. And at the end of it, as I said, I don't really like cows. But here's what I did like about this whole concept. This is out of the University of Arkansas. They have a 20-year database. And I will point out that they're talking about an 800-pound round bale, so smaller than the bales that we're typically seeing now. I kind of count 1,100-pound bales is what's common. But this is what intrigued me. One round bale gave the nutrient equivalent when fed on the land to the soil, from my understanding of this document. If you can just remember this while I click to the next slide. Let's just focus on nitrogen and potassium, 22 and 5. So now if you remember this nutrient balance that I did in that organic agronomy with the Prairie Organic Grain Initiative, I was taking out 41 and 9.5, just looking at nitrogen and phosphorus. It was 18 for the potassium, but that means that 2 800-pound bales would satisfy that 1 year of crop. And so realistically, I very quickly decided that if we could put, 5 bales to the acre, then we for sure, 5 800-pound bales or 4,000 pounds of hay, that would do our rotation of 2 years of cropping and 1 year of green manure for that nutrient uptake, very roughly. This is an article out of the University of Nebraska, and I want to point out that it's in US dollars and that their ton is only 2,000 pounds. You adjust for the price of the dollar difference and the difference in a 2,000-pound ton versus our metric 2,200-pound ton. In Canadian talk, that's $50 a ton of net gain for alfalfa hay going onto the land. Now, remember I had said that, Wally Ham had said 70 pounds was leaving. The difference between that and the rest of the article kind of talks about some of that. I just clipped this one paragraph out and put it here to shorten it up and fit it on. But essentially there's loss to volatilization of the nitrogen. You don't necessarily get all of it when the cows, plus the cows take about 15% of the nutrient with them as well. But this was really key for us in establishing a relationship with somebody to integrate cattle onto our farm, was recognizing that we will have a net benefit dollar impact of import of nutrient onto our farm. Here's another article from the Western Producer, 2015. And this is just in consideration of if a farmer was going to bale straw and export it from their land, just some rough math at the prices in 2015 said that was going to be a removal of $50 worth of nutrient. So when I was talking about feeding cattle on our land, well, obviously we're going to be doing some bedding as well. So suddenly I am doing math like crazy. And you don't have to dwell on all this. This was just for me to wrap it around in my head, but essentially feeding one bale per cow per month. Cutting right through it. I did some conversion there because the Arkansas bales were 800 pounds and the bales I use are 1,100 pounds. What I wanted to wind up with was what I've written down here in gold is, and I didn't intentionally put it in gold, I just wanted to differentiate it, but it was an eye-opener for me in this consideration. This means that feeding 100 cows would fertilize a quarter section with enough nutrient gain that I could take 2 subsequent years of harvest off at the estimated benchmark rate that I did for that wheat flax combination. But if you put this into dollar value, if those bales are 1,100 pounds that we're putting on, and I had said that we worked out that from that University of Nebraska article, it's $50 a ton, then an 1,100-pound bale is worth $25 of net nutrient gain onto the land, which was $15,000 a year. So you can bet, I told my stock owner he needed to buy more cows. So we already had gotten into this relationship with this farmer where we started to use the cows that were custom grazing on our land in the summertime, starting to use them more diversely as a tool on our farm. And it worked well for his business model for us to keep them here year round and even calve out here. And we started to learn then, as we started to feed cattle, that having the cattle on the land more easily allowed us to apply the other principles of soil health more effectively. And I mean, there's different versions of this within the realm of regenerative agriculture, but I kind of group some of them together to say, you know, minimizing soil disturbance, whether that's biological or chemical, by, you know, like putting on, you know, herbicides or synthetic fertilizer, or physical, which is the biggest bane of organic agriculture that we were struggling with. We realized that by integrating livestock, it more easily allowed us to provide consistent soil armor where, hey, if we're going to be feeding cattle out on the stubble, we weren't going to work that soil in the fall. And you'll see in some subsequent pictures, we were even dropping chaff on top of the straw rows and then letting the cattle graze on it. We were just leaving more residue on top of the soil because we were attempting to integrate livestock. And because we were utilizing the cattle to terminate our green manures, we also were no longer tilling the soil to incorporate that green manure, and we weren't wasting the fuel crop shredding it either. Now, the opportunities for having a continual live plant root, where we were doing more relay cropping with a biennial that would give us extended grazing on that stubble land after we took the crop off, or whether it was the fact that we were planting hay rotations again, both the plant diversity and its continual live plant root suddenly became easier to do by partnering with somebody to have livestock on our land. I haven't paused lots. I know Cody's chuckling right now because he knows that I can get going. I get into a lather talking about stuff. And it astounds my wife that these are the sorts of things that I can get passionate about. But in any case, jump in at any time if somebody's got a question.
We do actually have one question. Wondering if you charge for the cows. Do you charge per cow or per acre? How do you do that calculation?
You know,
you might have covered it. I zoned out there.
I haven't yet. I am coming to it, and if we do charge, currently we charge per cow, but you know, I'll kind of remind me again, and we'll touch on it at the end if I haven't answered it fully. But there's a number of different ways that this relationship could be set up, and it is timely where we're at this slide, because what that whole relationship means is or how it gets financially handled really depends on who's doing what responsibility there is of each of these participants. So we do charge a yardage rate per day, but we kind of sampled wherever we could find information on what winter yardage rates were for the season, and then we picked the bottom end of that. You know, like really coming in at about the very bottom, because we recognize that we're importing nutrient and we're getting some other benefit. But you know, still, if you have to build fence and install dugout wells to do that, you have to consider those costs. And so I'll touch on that more towards the end.
Okay. One other question I see here. Based on the information given, what's your current crop rotation, including the use of cattle?
Man, and that has been a real, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Follow up, what are your yields like?
So I haven't necessarily noticed a bump in yield, but I have to be fair that the last couple of seasons haven't been what I'd consider banner harvest conditions. And so I definitely haven't seen diminished crop yields, but I haven't seen, you know, dramatically higher. We typically, where we're at here, I kind of like to use a 5-year average when we're doing a crop. So without livestock, that hard red spring crop that I had shown before was right on our 5-year average, where we were 40 bushel to the acre of hard red spring wheat, and we got about 5 bushel to the acre of flax in with that. And a lot of people say, well, only 5 bushel to the acre of flax, that's not that impressive. But the reality is that we found that when we intercrop, the flax doesn't seem to take away from our 5-year average that we had before that of hard red spring wheat was still 40 bushel to the acre without the flax. So if the flax can be there and give a bit more diversity and act like a nutrient scavenger, and we can successfully salvage out 4 or 5 bushel to the acre that we can sell into the organic crush market, it's worth $35 a bushel. So it's easy to get $150 or $200 an acre extra on top of it. So that's kind of what we were looking at. But to be in all honesty, I haven't really seen a jump in yields. I'm hoping that's yet to come.
Right.
One more question, Joanna?
Just one, yeah. When you're feeding, do you bale graze, unroll? How do you manage that?
Also, that's going to yet be covered. So
awesome. All right.
Again, no, that's okay. Anybody who doesn't have their questions answered at the end, we'll cover these, because I'm finally just getting into this stuff where now, how is this structured and how are we managing this agreement? So this is us on the left, is Midmore Farms, and we decided that, you know, if we were going to work this out with this fellow who already had the cattle on our land for the custom grazing season, he was also certified organic, and he was doing certified free range as well. So it was enticing for him to have his cattle out on the land 365 days of the year. And on top of that, he also doesn't actually own his own land base, and we'll kind of get to that as well, but he rents a half section as a home farm, and most of his, like, he does most of his finishing of his steers and heifers there, but his primary breeding herd is out on our land. So in this arrangement, we will do the feeding, but all of the hay that those cows are getting fed, if it's processed or dry feed, he owns it. He provides it and delivers it to the farm. Now, some of that could be hay that is produced on our land, but either we hay it and put it up and set it there, and he pays us for that hay and he owns it before we feed it, or we sell it to him standing and he comes and harvests it and he still owns it. And that provided another whole layer of complexity of how do we value the hay. You know, there's some challenges and some synergies that can be found there. But in this winter grazing arrangement, we were responsible for feeding and for watering. And that could be, hey, if we wanted to go out and chop a hole in the ice every day, that's up to us. You know, we didn't want to do that. We installed a dugout well beside a dugout where we could winter all our water all year long. We're responsible for the wind protection, and that could be whatever we decide, as long as it meets the approval of the cattle owner, as long as he feels that they're sufficiently protected. But we would buy some wind panels, we would put bedding areas up against shelter belts, and sometimes we even used hay stacks or straw stacks, bedding stacks, as some of that wind protection. We were responsible for putting the mineral out, but we didn't purchase the mineral because that was definitely part of his nutrient management for his livestock. So he would source it, drop it off at our farm, but we had to make sure that there was always a free source available for the cattle. So we were obligated to inform the stock owner if there were any ailments, but ultimately it was his responsibility to come and do regular checks on the animals through the winter to make sure that his nutritional recipe that he told us to put out and feed these cattle was maintaining the condition of the animals to his liking. Because honestly, that whole thing, to look at a cow and go, oh, that cow's not doing well, to me, I can't score body condition of an animal. That's just Greek to me completely. I mean, unless it's blatantly obvious. I found for sure that if their legs are sticking up in the air, that's not a good cow. But that was poor taste. Yardage rates, and somebody had talked about, what do we charge for this? And we really priced it as low as we thought was feasible because we had to consider the value of the nutrient import onto our land. So the cattle owner pays that yardage rate, and as I said, they're responsible for that feed ration plan. Just a couple of shots here of some of what we're talking about. The handling facility is supplied by the stock owner. So he just showed up with a trailer load of panels and set up a round corral and squeeze in the back and a secondary containment. And he's responsible for doing all of that processing, tagging, inoculation, whatever he's got to do. That's his baby. We just had to make space for him to set it up on the land. As I said, wind protection, this was the first year we started out, and for clarity, we've done this for 3 years now, and it's evolved every year. So part of it evolved because his herd was expanding. He started out the first year, when he first came and was grazing on a portion of our custom grazing pasture, he had 24 head of cattle. When he had the prospect of keeping them there year round, he had expanded by that point to 45 head of cattle. And here we're winter bale grazing on just on the paddocks, the 20-acre paddocks that we had, just to kind of figure out the rest of it, the fencing, the electric fence in the wintertime, watering the cattle. It took us a while to wrap our heads around that and kind of come up with a system that was working. So bale grazing was an easy start, and bale grazing was great, but it didn't give us the nice even nutrient dispersal that we thought would be successful on stubble land. And so when we're on the stubble land, we are unrolling or shredding and spreading out in rows on the field. It's just a shot of in the second season. You can see that the cows are heading out beyond. This is on the custom grazing pasture, and the cows are heading out to eat where we're feeding on the adjacent stubble land. We just installed the dugout well with a concrete pad for them to stand on, and it's just Sundog solar motion eye and bowl. It just acts like the water comes up in your bathroom. It works like a bathroom sink. It's just that the water comes up through the drain when the pump turns on, when the cow walks up, and it works fairly well. But our challenge is we couldn't do it with 110 volt, and I put in a battery bank and a pure sine inverter to convert that 24 volt system to AC power, because I can buy a little utility pump that'll lift to that for, I bought them on sale at Princess Auto for $30. Whereas if you do a 12 volt or a 24 volt pump, they're, $600 to $1,500. And so, but I've had to do some learning there, because you can see there's also a generator sitting there. Because if a cow wants to come up and stand there all day chewing its cud, sometimes those batteries will run down. And so we have the generator there with 030 oil on standby, just to, if the batteries run dead or if it's been cloudy and snowy for a few days. So still some concerns, but it's a lot better than what we did the first year, where we chopped a hole through the ice and dropped the pump down in there in a milk crate and just filled a trough. And, by January 1st, I had 3 feet of ice in my trough, and I was struggling with it. But all the cattle guys are laughing, because they're like, suck it up, Buttercup. Still, like I say, it was challenging. But I just included this shot because to do the 120 acres right adjacent to the pasture took us a day and a half for most of that fence, because we did wide spacing, 2 wires, hot wire, steel T-post with insulators. It went in really fast, and I was stressed about it. But the reality is, as soon as it snows, the cows give that fence no regard, because there's nothing underneath it for them to eat, and they just kind of stay wherever you're feeding them. So I love it. At Christmas time, my brothers were out. They were raised on this farm, and and we go driving past, and I say, hey, look out there, there's my agronomy team working in the field. So just to touch on some of the benefits that there are to the grain farmer by integrating livestock, by partnering with somebody to do this. Of course, you get the nutrient import for the hay or the straw that gets hauled in. You get the added soil health, the enhanced biology. As I said, I wouldn't get that if I were spreading rock phosphate and langbeinite and elemental sulfur. I'm putting the nutrient there, but I don't get that synergetic relationship with the gut flora of the animal and the soil biology, which, to be fair, I don't claim to understand it. I try, but I don't know that I have to utilize it effectively. I just need to create the conditions where I get it. Having the livestock allows us to terminate the green manure with lower machinery and fuel costs. There's an opportunity for salvaging a failed crop. If I have an organic crop that's too weedy, now any of the rest of you are organic, I know that you would never have a crop that's too weedy, but I'm still aspiring to be that top shelf organic farmer. And sometimes I do have weed pressure that is just a lot easier to go out and swath it and let the cows come in, swath it before it makes viable seed and let the cows come and graze it. Or if we decide soon enough, we can actually even just start them grazing on it. And then I only swath it and wild oats tends to be what I'm always watching is as soon as it gets up into that panicle, I want to have it chopped down. But in any case, there's that benefit there. There's a way for us to value add either grain screenings or chaff with the addition of a chaff blower onto our grain harvesting equipment or a chaff collector. And for the first time in 20 years, we have perennial forage back in our rotation, which somebody had asked that question, and we really struggled with it because we essentially want to take each of our pieces of land that were on the 3/4 that were in yellow, and we're trying to develop a plan to say, well, how do we put a 4-year alfalfa mix into that rotation and still maintain cash flow? And we struggled with it, but we realized that in sitting with the stock person, it makes better money for both of us if we can feed more of it standing and less of it as dry feed. I charge $1 a day per cow-calf pair for the grazing, but just in rough numbers, by the time we get to the point where it's yardage cost and the cost of his feed, he's about $2.50 a day if we're feeding. So, but my yardage cost drops down to 60 cents a day is what I'm charging for feeding his cows. So I make more money by owning the standing crop, and he doesn't have to pay as much because all of that value of putting that feed up can be saved if you just let the cows harvest it. Now again, to all of you stock people, this is just as simple as breathing oxygen, but all of this was revolutionary thinking to the organic grain guy. So so we have struggled. We've got 2 or 3 different plans that allow us opportunity to say, in those 3/4 sections, how do we incorporate a 4-year rotation or put some of that land, 80 acres at a time, into 4 years of alfalfa, and then 2 or 3 years into that stand, then we establish the next one. And for a while, I was worried about the cash flow, about our farm needing that grain cash crop revenue. But what we've found is that feeding the cows, whether they're grazing or whether we're winter feeding, is offsetting that. And at the same time, we are still getting the nutrient import and the soil health benefit. So possibly do forage on your grain land and grain on the stock owner's forage land. I put that separated a little bit down at the bottom because it does present the benefit of not just considering our own land base, but what if the stock owner, as an idea, if I say, well, that's really going to crunch our cash flow, well, why don't we set it up that he rents my land for 80 acres, and he owns that forage crop with the assurance that that feed that comes from it is going to be fed on my adjacent land. And in return, I rent land from him on some of his other land base, because it's easier for me to go a few miles away and break up his hayland that needs a change, and I can grain farm it. And so it presents that opportunity. So that could be a benefit to both sides. I've listed it here with the grain farmer, but what I'm trying to say is that having that land put back into forage after years of organic grain farming, I'm just now really starting to understand that really helps the fungal to bacterial ratio in the soil that creates a condition where there's less annual weed germination. So how do you quantify that and put a value on it so that I just recognize that that's a value for me, and that's why I've listed it here as a benefit for the grain farmer. So grain farmer benefits continued. I know there's lots of stuff. It's a busy slide, but I feel it's easier where everybody's sitting in their computer. I didn't parse it down and make it smaller. But we have a winter revenue stream with limited market risk. And to me, that's one of the benefits of not owning the cows. And yes, I know when cow prices are high, it may make you second guess, but the reality is not only am I intimidated about the animal welfare, but there is the extra burden of playing another completely, in my mind, speculative market. I already do that with grain and with herbal and nutraceutical crops, and the oscillations within the organic pricing is more volatile, wider ranging than it is even with conventional, or in my opinion. And so I do get a revenue stream from those cows, but it's a guaranteed revenue stream. It's not subject to the whims of the market. So whenever our stock owner makes really good money when prices are good, hey, that's just good for my business as well, because he's more likely to keep doing what he's doing. But if the market is down, that's also not my risk. So as I mentioned, this stock owner on this second point, he doesn't own his own land base. He's a younger guy, but he has now got 120 head of cattle, and he doesn't own any land. So our farm is supporting another link, another business entity in our local organic food chain. And I kind of like that. He wouldn't have necessarily been able to buy the land and grow this herd economically. It's allowed him to expand more quickly, which kind of already covered that one. So the benefit to the grain farmer is that you can strike a deal to only perform the tasks that you want, which is what I did. So I easily just struck something that's like, hey, these are the things about livestock that don't stress me out. I'll do those. All the things that stress me out, the stock owner does those. And then we landed on that price. And that's why it's tough to say, hey, what price would you charge? Because it really depends on what that agreement winds out being. But if you want to make more money from that revenue stream, the grain farmer could do more of it. Grain farmer could provide no labor at all. And you could just turn around and say, well, look, if there's going to be all this money, $15,000 a year to feed 100 head of cattle, I'm going to benefit $15,000 on my land. I don't know if I got to the slide did I cover that one already? At the bale per day for 100 head of cattle for 6 months of the year with 600 bales at $25 a bale, that's $15,000. I could just say, hey, I'll give you $15,000. Bring your 100 head of cattle and put them on my land and do nothing else. And I'm sure that there are stock people, if they said that they could get $25 a bale for their feed costs to feed them on somebody else's land, there's probably people who would be interested in doing that. The stock owner may even choose out of that $15,000 for 100 head to not do it himself. He might pay somebody else to do it. And there's an example of a business near us that does that, Greener Pastures Ranching. Steve and Amber Kenyon out of Busby. They'll frequently do that where they'll have a grain farmer who wants to have cattle on their land, and they will source cattle and say, hey, we'll feed your cattle for the winter for this kind of price. And they kind of take a portion on both sides, and they get paid, and both the grain farmer and the stockman don't have to worry about it. And I think it's a cool business model. So, stock owner benefits. If you were from the perspective of owning the cattle, why would you be enticed to let somebody else feed their cattle on their land, or you feed your cattle on their land? Well, there's the potential for herd expansion without having to own more land base. Of course, there's a little bit of risk there. It would have to be somebody you trust who's not going to pull the rug out from under you. You know, if you expand your herd to a size that's a land base that's more than, you know, require a land base more than what you own, and suddenly they change their mind, you know, you'd need some assurances there. No manure handling at home, or litter or residue concerns on your own land. That problem goes to the grain farm if you consider it a problem. You can potentially decrease your winter labor requirements. I know lots of stock people that you know, for them to take an overnight trip in the winter time is a big deal. And so if you can actually lower your labor costs in that time, because, you know, maybe you're only checking condition on your animals once a week, it definitely makes it better. You could potentially get a lower yardage rate for feeding your cows if you're already getting custom feeding done. This could be lower if the grain farmer that you broker a deal with gives consideration to the nutrient value. And at the end of the day, as much as I try to extricate myself from the things that cause me stress about the animal welfare, the reality is we're out there checking the water once a day. And suddenly you notice that cow has a limp, or that this cow has lice, or something like that. And it's just extra eyes on the cattle. More stock owner benefits. Oh, I kind of touched on this one. You're far more likely to take a vacation, even if you wind up just staying home reading a book because of COVID-19. It's still, according to Justin Trudeau, still a vacation. Sorry, I'm not supposed to get political. Potentially lower feed costs if the grain farmer is using an on-farm feedstock. So for us, if we decide to put some of our land into alfalfa, and we get the benefit for, you know, nutrient lifting and perennial weed control, the reality is that's a lot shorter haul of that feed to get it to the place where you're going to feed your cattle. Chaff collection also presents, and harvesting green manure, all of that is right there on the land base, right where you might be feeding them. And the other thing is, if you are putting up hay, not only is it a shorter haul, but there truly might be less string requirements, right? You only put 6 wraps on the bale if you're hauling it a quarter mile to where you're going to be feeding in the winter. And it's also a close haul for the bedding and the straw. This is a shot of a windrow of barley that was in the field where we were winter feeding the cattle this winter. And you can see by the wide spacing, we had taken an old Redicop chaff collector and put it onto our combine and used the cyclone and just dropped the chaff onto the straw. And we just left it there. We only picked up every second row of straw and gathered that over to the corner of the field where we had good wind protection for the winter. And we had a bedding area that was only 100 meters from our compost yard to haul it, so that straw pack for the bedding area for the winter was good for us as a compost accelerant for all of the dry feedstocks we have. But the rest of the feed we were going to spread out on the field, and so we only harvested up for straw every second swath, and then we just left this chaff in the row. And on the feed analysis, because this was undersowed with sweet clover, the protein on this was 17%. Sorry, 12%. That was I'm confusing my feed analysis, but it was 12%. So those cows, when the snow had come and it was to the depth of the stubble, you know, the full depth from the wrist to your tip of your finger in there, which isn't very much yet, but it was in November, we wound up grazing them, just continued extending our grazing season by moving almost doing like a swath grazing scenario on our stubble land, and didn't have to supplement any feed for the first 4 weeks. And so we just kept charging the $1 a day grazing rate as the cattle cleaned up before the snow came, cleaned up the low areas, the slough areas, and last year we had lots of slough areas that drowned out. And so we got the benefit from that. And so I have this is just an example of how we came across utilizing this straw chopper that was not at all labor intensive, to just drop it with a cyclone out the back of the combine on top of the straw row and then let the cattle forage on it. And they got surprisingly good animal grazing days out of that. But anyway, I make the statement, offer the cattle as a soil enhancement benefit to the grain farmer in exchange for subsidized feed. Or if you're the grain farmer, you say, hey, I can give you subsidized feed, and I recognize that I'm getting this soil enhancement benefit. We also gathered off all of the chaff from the rest of our grain land and hauled it there and fed it through the winter. And where we didn't even know really how to price it, I was willing for the first year to just donate it for free, because as the organic grain guy, I can actually set this, you know, set the fan on my combine differently than I have. I always used to run it, the wind on my air separation chamber on my combine way lower to try to salvage and catch as many of those weed seeds as possible and keep them in my grain tank and then separate them at the seed cleaning plant or in my yard. Whereas now I'm only catching the heaviest weed seeds and I'm blowing the light ones into the chaff and I'm feeding it to the cattle in the same area that we're bedding, where I'm hoping to scrape all of that up. I mean, I know the cattle are going to spread some of those weed seeds, but the reality is I've been spreading those weed seeds for 20 years just out of the chaff blower on my combine before we started to collect it. So those weed seeds were going to be on my land anyway. The reality is that if I get some nutrient benefit for that stock owner, it becomes a way that we can make it more enticing for him to stay. But we did find that this was far more labor intensive than just dropping it on the straw swath. And that's new to us this year. It's the first time we've done this chaff collection. You know, the key points here, draft an agreement as a basis to work from, but don't let it fence you in. Each year, the herd size is expanded, and how we're feeding and where we're feeding it, the methodology changes, and you just have to find somebody who can recognize that the synergy of this relationship. But both of you have to be very open with saying, hey, this isn't working for me. And the other person can't take offense to it. Like you have to realize that it's in both parties' best interest to participate together on something. And I recognize that not everybody can be wired to be in a relationship without suspecting a business relationship, without constantly suspecting that they're getting the short end of the stick. And we found that if both of us are just moderately uncertain about whether or not it's working for us, that seems to be the right compromise. And once we get used to recognizing that, then we say, okay, if we're both just a little bit unhappy, that's probably the most fair. And the reality is, I'm not doing it because I like cows. I'm doing it because I like wheat crops that look like that. Even if they're getting harvested by a vintage swather. This was from a few years back, because you notice it's also not a John Deere combine back then. But we weren't doing it because we like cows, that's for certain. We're doing it because it's just good stewardship. And I can take more questions.
All righty. I see we've got a question here about, have you tried wintering cows just on snow with no water?
you know, even our stock owner has suggested that. He thinks that we were, well, he's conscious of the fact that, you know, when we go dig a dugout well, pour concrete, and put in a solar watering system, he was a little stressed that we're spending money, and because of that, his yardage rate was higher. I was justifying a higher yardage rate. And so he was saying, hey, like, you know, he's running a rugged herd that he wants to be out there grazing, and he says, like, you know, if you don't give them water, they'll eat snow. And again, this may be I met part way. So we've noticed that the farther away they get, the less likely they are to come for water. But from an animal welfare perspective that won't keep me awake at night, I feel I have an obligation to make that water available all the time. And if they choose not to take it, then that's fine. But, you know, the stock owner himself calls me chicken stuff because of it. But that's just where we're at, just for my comfort level.
Makes sense. All right. There was a question about the legal agreement. You mentioned kind of how that all works, though, so I think that's all right.
And there was a thought that came up just recently talking about this with another neighbor. You know, they said, well, what happens if those cows get out? What's the liability risk exposure for your farm as the grain farmer? And I said, well, you know, that is something that you should put down, and it should be a written agreement. And in all honesty, we don't have a written agreement. We've talked about it, and we took notes, and I wrote it in my fancy coil-bound scribbler that I keep on my desk, and we'll go back and review it to see what we said. And the reality is that each of us respect that note-taking, like minutes from a meeting. But it might serve you well to have a formal written agreement signed by both parties, because currently in our situation, where I'm responsible for the fencing, I also then, in my mind, bear the liability exposure if those cattle are not contained. Whereas if I just said, hey, I'll pay you for your 100 head of cows, I'll pay you $15,000, feed them on my land, please. And they provide the fencing to do that, and then they get out, well, you'd want to make that clear.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A box, and nobody's got their hands raised. So I think that might be where we'll call it for today. Thank you very much, Ward, for coming and telling us about your operation. It was, I know I learned something, so hopefully everybody else did too. And for the rest of you, if you would like to drop some feedback for us in our survey at the end of, that'll pop up at the end of the webinar, that'd be great. This is kind of new to PCBFA running these webinar series, so if you have any feedback, we'll be interested to know what you think. And other than that, I believe next week is our final webinar, and we'll have a couple of local Peace Country producers up to talk about what they're doing on their operations and how and what kind of they've been dealing with and how it works for them. So I think, unless Marianne has anything to add, I think that is the end of our webinar. So thank you all for coming.
Joanna?
Thanks, everyone.
Yes.
I would just add that if anybody had any other questions or wanted to contact me, that you guys are welcome to share my contact information, whether that's my email or my phone number.
Awesome. I think I will, I'll drop that in the email I send out for the recording here. I think is how we'll do that. So, if anybody's interested in that, that's where you'll be able to find Ward's info.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Have a good weekend.